In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. gave what would become one of the most influential and one of the most recognizable speeches of modern history. You all know the one I'm talking about. We've all quoted from it. We've all heard it 100 times. In that speech, he said, "I have a dream." He said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's what I want you to concentrate on for the next 5 minutes. Excuse me. Now, just 1 year after this speech was given, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was a landmark legislation that, among other things, made it illegal for employers to discriminate against those who sought employment or those who were already in their employment. They could not discriminate based on those things you see there: race, color, religion, sex, national origin. This was exactly what was being sought. Finally, we had a level playing field for everybody, where everybody had a chance to do what they needed to lift themselves out of poverty, if such was the case for them. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. Just 1 year later, and in subsequent years, we started a program that was called Affirmative Action. I use we, meaning this country, of course. Now, in 1965, there was one executive order and an amendment that came out that provided these measures that you see here. What it basically says is that employers will hire who the government thinks they should hire. In 1971, here's another example, the Secretary of Commerce could now distribute funds meant for entrepreneurs based on that person's racial or racial status or other minority status, if they were part of what was called the protected class. This is a huge step backward. This is exactly what we were trying to avoid with things like Martin Luther King's speech, things like the Civil Rights Act. Notice the difference in language. The Civil Rights Act said that you cannot discriminate based on these things. Along comes affirmative action, and suddenly we're told that we need to discriminate. We need to give entitlements to those that we feel need them based simply on the color of their skin, not the content of their character. Now, some would argue that this was needed, that minority groups were stuck in a cycle of poverty and they couldn't lift themselves out. They needed help. Well, I would beg to differ. I'll show you just one stat from just one group, because that's all I have time for. But in 1940, African American families, by a measure of 87%, were living below the U.S. poverty line. That's a pretty astounding number if you ask me, 87% of families living in poverty. Well, in 20 years, between 1940 and 1960, they lowered that to 47%. That's a drop of 40% in 20 years without any significant civil rights legislation. They lifted themselves, as the saying goes, by their own bootstraps. They got themselves out of poverty. Now, this trend continued with the civil rights legislation that came around, like I said, in 1964. And for that decade of the 1960s, this trend continued. It dropped from 47% down to 30%. But then notice what happens once affirmative action comes into the picture. Soon entitlements were being given rather than justice. And that decline stopped. In fact, in 10 years, it went from 30% to 29%, which is well within any margin of error for any of you statisticians out there. So this decline dropped, and it's remained the same to this day. Blacks are still at about 30% of families in poverty. This, like I said, is exactly what we were trying to avoid, and it's still going on today. Affirmative action is still being pushed through Congress, through the White House, and it's doing the opposite of what it was intended to do. Affirmative action has stopped the ability of some groups to bring themselves out of poverty. It's giving entitlements rather than justice and telling people that they don't have to work for what they need or what they want. It'll be given to them based simply on the color of their skin. Now, luckily, there is something that we can do about this. Every one of us here, there are two things. First, you need to get informed. Second, you need to get involved. Getting informed involves simply reading your newspaper, turning on the news every once in a while, see what our lawmakers are doing, both locally and nationally. Get involved means, quite simply, vote. But don't just vote. Understand what you're voting for. Don't vote for a little letter next to somebody's name, but understand what the issues are, what they stand for. In this case, make sure that they stand for justice for all, so that none of us will be judged by the color of our skin, but rather by the content of our character. Thank you.